Yeah, actually I will speak in English. I hope this will not be a problem, even though I'll be referring and drawing heavily from Etienne Balibar's recent Violence et Civilité. But we'll put it in a different light and engage in a certain debate with his solution of what I will call the Kantian Paradox. So my talk has basically four points. One is a development of an achievement account of rationality, which will lead me to a certain reconsideration of the concept of normativity in contemporary normativity theory. The second part is precisely on what I will call the Kantian Paradox, which is a generalization of a problem we all know from Hobbes, e statu naturae ex eundum. And then I will develop a kind of different non-hegemonic reading of Hegel's philosophy of right and show that in Hegel we have the operation of a disjunctive synthesis, which is not the disjunctive synthesis into two forms of extreme violence, but into two forms of extreme capacities, okay? Into the capacity of law and the capacity of ethics. The capacity thus of good and evil and the capacity of lawful and illegal. And I do think that this capacity account can explain certain aspects that probably the violence account can't. But this will be then, of course, a topic of this for discussion with Etienne Balibar. So let me start with a localization of the project that I'm currently working on in this context. So what is an achievement account of rationality? So contemporary, in particular, North American normativity theory tries to draw on a famous Kantian distinction that between laws of nature, and norms, okay? And it tries to achieve precisely what Etienne Balibar has called the transcendence over necessity. So law and ethics coincide in this perspective because they have a common basis, and the common basis is the operation of transcending necessity. So this is what the human being is. The human being transcends necessity, both in the form of law and in the form of ethics. So basically, it doesn't matter where you draw the line, ethics and law coincide. It's just the same thing from the perspective of, say, Bob Brandon, Bob Pippin, and those guys. Okay, this is what I have in mind. So this is where they all agree. Okay, also people like Korsgaard and Tom Nagel and among others in Germany, Axel Honneth and so forth. So that is the starting point of contemporary North American, which includes parts of Germany, North American Frankfurt has become something like a brand of the University of Chicago. Okay, but anyways, those guys try to develop this achievement account. And why do they want to do this? Okay, what is the reason behind this? Here's what I think why they want to talk about rationality in terms of an achievement, and then also I'll tell you what's going wrong in my view. Okay, so here's the reason. If rationality, okay, is in some way or other tied to the exercise of a capacity which cannot be reduced, okay, to a natural fact, that's the Wittgensteinian tradition, then how can we explain the objectivity of the exercise of this capacity? So if we have a radical dualism between norm and nature, then what does it mean for norms to be objective? If your model of objectivity is correspondence with facts, okay, and if you model facts along mountains, okay, if the standard concept of an object in your theory of objectivity is that of a mountain, then how can something like marriage or stealing a car be objective? Okay, so that's the problem. The Martians come to Earth, they see someone doing something with a car, but they will not see someone stealing a car because normative facts in some way or other don't look objective. So how do you explain the objectivity? And here's the idea. Well, think of rationality in terms of an achievement that is in terms of the successful exercise of a capacity. So a capacity being successfully exercised is objective. A capacity in its failure would not be objective. That seems to be the idea. This way, you can, or so it seems, have both your cake and eat it. Because on the one hand, you take account of everything which speaks in favor of solipsism. Okay, well, mind is not out there. Mind is not the meat machine in my skull, and so forth. So mind is in some way or other can still be constructed on a Kantian basis, but okay, it is objective. Why? Well, because it consists in the exercise of a capacity, either successful or a failure. So that's the idea, I think. Okay, best elaborated in Pippin's reading of Hegel, in Pippin on Hegel on agency. Okay, which okay, so that's the idea. But why does this not work? Well, because we need to draw an important distinction between rationality and reason, and a corresponding distinction between normality and normativity. Okay, and here's how this goes. Well, obviously, as we've heard today, among other things from Bertrand Angivy, the exercise of rationality does not guarantee reason. Okay, there's something like a mad cogito. For example, you know, I see that even a mad inferential cogito. Imagine Bob Brandon goes mad. Okay, and I meet him at the airport, and he tells me, "Sorry, I have to kill you." I ask him, "Why do you have to kill me?" He's like, "Well, if you have an alien inside of you, you know, Sigourney Weaver style alien, okay, if you have an alien inside of you, okay, which can burst out any moment, then I better kill you in order to save humanity. I know you have such an alien inside of you because my mom just called me, okay, therefore I need to tell you." Well, perfect exercise of his inferential capacities, okay. So according to inferentialism, that was a rational, that was a nice conclusion and a successful exercise of rationality, as opposed to, for example, a logical mistake. I can try to show him that he committed a logical mistake, but in the end he didn't. He used modus ponens. Hence, I have to say, well, okay, Bob, you have to kill me. So something's wrong about the identification of achievement and objectivity, because there are successful exercises of rationality which do not amount to reason, because reason is a normative notion. Okay, but this is when sometimes we say this and that is reasonable. Okay, and I do think, by the way, that Hegel has this aspect of rationality in mind when he says, for example, that the actual is reasonable, or when he says in the logic that that we should model our concept of truth along the concept of when we say a true friendship or a true state. I don't see him being a Platonist there when he says, well, there are true states and false states. I see him saying, when we say reason and truth, we have something genuinely normative in mind, which cannot be reduced, okay, to any exercise of a capacity. But we need particular conditions for objectivity or objective constraints. So the question is, where do they come from? Okay, and these guys think that the constraints come out of the practice itself. So there must be something about the practice, which is not a fact about the practice, because facts are mountains, okay? So there must be something about the practice they would not really want to call a fact, okay, which guarantees friction. And at this point, okay, things become politically dangerous, okay? Because if you look into the text, what are the answers? Usually something like authority, okay? People always forget that in the subtitle of Making It Explicit, you have the nice word authority. So it's a book about, it's basically a book on authority. Okay, so that's their reading, you know, that's a problematic aspect of Wittgenstein. Okay, so if forms of life are, as Wittgenstein says, das hinzunehmende Gegebene, then you lose, okay, a genuinely objective account of reason. You will never have this again. So as long as a sufficiently huge number of people agrees on calling this rule following, it will be rule following. That's the problem. Okay, I think a similar problem is exactly pointed out by Maurizio in his critique of Searle's account of social objects in terms of X plus collective intentionality. So I think that's the problem there. They confuse normality with normativity, or even worse, okay, dispositions with norms. Okay, even though Brandon writes his 800 pages in order to show that norms are not dispositions, in the end it turns out that his concept of a norm is identical to a concept of disposition. He's a dispositionalist in Kripke's sense. So there's just no theory of normativity, surprisingly, in a book which is meant to give us a theory of normativity, precisely because there is no genuine notion of a norm, of an objective norm. So, and that was part one, the achievement of account of rationality and its shortcomings. Two, the Kantian Paradox. And now, evidently, this account gives rise to a particular paradox, okay, which they also call the Kantian Paradox, and which in its historically, of course, originates from the Hobbesian tradition. I think it's basically the same as Hobbes's paradox. That is, you know, how can someone want to achieve a state of law, okay, how can someone bind oneself to a law without this act of binding already being legal or illegal. So you presuppose the dualism of legal and illegal in order to explain how someone can make a transition from a position without law to a position with law. That, of course, simply doesn't work. And the same holds for the Kantian idea, as they spell it, which is rather an early Fichtean idea, for the Kantian idea that the subject has to generate itself autonomously, where autonomously means that it binds itself, okay, in the light of its capacity to bind itself. That's the version of autonomy. Because one needs, of course, to distinguish between a creature capable of binding itself to laws or rules, rule following, for example, my dog, okay, discipline is sufficient for my dog to follow rules, and a creature which can bind itself in the light of its capacity to bind itself. That would be autonomy in the Kantian tradition. So what human beings do is they can bind themselves in the light of the capacity to bind themselves. Or as Hegel puts it, okay, the free will is the will which wills the free will. Okay, that's how they read this. So in a sense, this self-constituting spontaneity. But if you have a self-constituting spontaneity, you need to presuppose an illegal, anarchical state or pre-legal state and explain how you can go from the pre-legal state, okay, to the position of autonomy. So where does autonomy come from? Or what is the origin of modernity in Pippin's terms? And you will never really get an answer. Okay? And you can see this, for example, in Pippin's book on Western. If you read his book on Western, okay, he always only talks about the achievement of modernity and so forth. But, for example, in his reading of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, neither mentions the Indians nor, more interestingly, the Mexicans. He just gave a paper on Nicholas Ray's In a Lonely Place in Bonn last week, okay? And the whole movie, In a Lonely Place, is also about the Mexicans. If you take a very close look at the house where the protagonists live, you will see that they own all sorts of Mexican paintings. Okay, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, of course, very standard knowledge of Mexico. But anyway, so you will see that a certain imagery of Mexico, and not only of the Indians, is present in Western. They never talk about that. They only talk about the pre-legal force of liberty balance, fighting with the institution of the law and the imaginary involved in this and so forth. But where are the Indians and where are the Mexicans? Okay, they are precisely not mentioned because they think of the constitution of autonomy in terms of a version of a creation out of nothing. Okay, which simply doesn't work because it generates a bad paradox. Okay, you can't get the process of autonomy started. It comes from nowhere. That's always the problem with the Kantian, Fichtean, and so forth account of spontaneity. Where does it come from? It can't have a genealogy, so it's eternal or what? I mean, Kant also doesn't really give us an answer to this question, which is why historicism was the first answer to the problem in 19th century philosophy. This is where historicism comes from. It looks in, where does the subject come from? It seems to have a history. So that's the Kantian paradox, and I do think the Kantian paradox is structurally in a relevant way, similar to the Hobson paradox, which is why both Kant and Hobbes and so forth still elaborate on the same problem. Okay, so how can you get from pre-legal, anarchical to government? You can't. Okay, and now what does Hegel do with this? And I think Hegel addresses precisely this question with his philosophy of right. Okay, and it looks indeed, and there's sufficient evidence for this, as if his picture was one of hegemony. So you go through the stages, okay, Moralität, Sittlichkeit, and so forth, and in the end what you have is the state governs the whole structure, okay? So it looks nicely hierarchical. So you have these layers of reality, and on top of the structure is the state governing everything. And then, of course, you might easily associate state and reason here in the normative sense, and then you get bad Hegel, okay? So it's always very easy to get bad Hegel, of course, but here's bad Hegel. But there's a good aspect in the whole account, and I want to associate this aspect with Hegel's concept of retroactivity or belatedness, okay? And I do think that Hegel is after a very important idea here, expressed famously in The Owl of Minerva and Philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought talk, This idea, of course, has later been very nicely developed in France, basing on the basis of Freud, Nachträglichkeit, après coup, and so forth. Okay, so I will simply call this retroactivity. I think that Hegel is a theorist of retroactivity. And what does this mean? I think Hegel thinks of the establishment of normative objectivity in terms of retroactivity. So retroactively, okay, the family becomes the family, or retroactively, subjective spirit becomes subjective spirit in objective spirit. So the picture is not so much first you have some wild, crazy animal. You know, this is how he begins in the philosophy of subjective spirit, with madness, the night of the world. Okay, so in the beginning, crazy animal, and then crazy animal kind of disciplines itself, and then it builds up. Okay, this is the linear story. But I do think that Hegel is really telling a retroactive story. So retroactively, the possibility of being a pre-legal, anarchical, brutal, mad enemy, and animal is generated by objective spirit. So subjective spirit is a property of objective spirit. It's not as if there were, for Hegel, okay, as if there were subjects out there, but we start with institutions. There's no way to think of subjective spirit outside of a theory of institutions, which is the point that I want to make by saying Hegel gives an account of retroactivity. So that's his solution. And why is this a solution? Let me give you a comparison where it also seems to work. Okay, an explanation of semantic objectivity. Okay, let's call obviously mountains are objects. Okay, and now the good old Berkeley so-called master problem is, well, if I think of the mountain, what happens to the mountain? Sometimes something seems to be happening to the mountain if I start thinking about the mountain. Okay, and if you have a bad epistemology, it looks as if there were no mountains independent of your grasp of the mountain. Or even worse, there are no mountains if no one has the concept mountain, or even the word mountain, which is possibly the worst position on this spectrum. Okay, but how do we explain the mountain case? Well, precisely in terms of retroactivity. The mountain has become constituted, okay, in the domain of truth at thought as something which is independent of that domain. This is exactly what you grasp when you grasp the fact that there's a mountain in front of you. You grasp something which is independent of being grasped, but you grasp it. And I do think that this retroactivity is, for Hegel, at stake in the philosophy of objective spirit. And the most important point that I want to focus on is the disjunctive synthesis between law and ethics. Okay? The whole book, of course, is called Philosophy of Right and not Philosophy of Law. And right, for Hegel, subsumes law and ethics. Law, what he calls Gesetz, is only one aspect of what he calls Recht. Recht seems to be rather something like the most general name for objective normativity. Okay? Recht in German also means was Recht ist. Okay, or is associated with the concept of validity. So, Philosophie des Rechts is a philosophy of objective validity. And objective validity can precisely not be achieved in terms of morality. That's one of the famous aspects of this analysis. You need institutions. Maybe you need documents for institutions, that would be an additional step, but at least you need institutions. That is Hegel's point. And now, what do these institutions do? I do think that for Hegel, institutions, okay, are something like the universal societal sphere generating the possibility of transgression for subjects. And this possibility of transgression, that's ethics. Ethics is the theory of the possibility of transgression. Okay, which is why the ethical subject, the moral subject, okay, can oppose itself to the law. That's exactly what it can do. And this is also how we can transcend the law. That's for Hegel one of the conditions of possibility also of critique. Hegel's not the philosopher who always says, well, there's no morality, there's only the state, just follow the Prussians, when they call you, just do whatever they tell you. On the contrary, the very existence of a state, also in its oppressive dialectical capacity, it's not for Hegel necessarily oppressive, but it has a dialectical capacity for oppression, namely by being, due to its very concept, okay, the oppression of violence. Okay? And the oppression of violence can turn into a violent oppression. But I don't think that this is necessary. The Derrida quote I find in Violence et Civilité, I would contradict that. I do not think that necessarily the oppression of violence or counter-violence is even more violent than ordinary violence. It might become more violent because it can disguise itself in the forms of benevolence, but it's not necessarily or structurally more violent. I think this would be a weird claim. Okay, so the police can be really bad, but I do not want to think. I think there are very good reasons to think of the police not in terms of my worst enemy. You know, if I walk through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, I agree that sometimes, and for some people, the police is seriously a problem, but it's not. You know, it's not the worst force out there. Okay, so there's not. I don't think that conceptually. Okay, there's something about the police which makes it the worst enemy of freedom or any such thing. Okay, it depends very much. It's a capacity. Okay, just as morality. And if that's Hegel's point, okay, then you have a disjunction of capacities. Okay, implicit for him in the concept of right, law, and ethics. Okay, or the subject associated to ethics and the object associated to law, which is why law is blind. It's precisely not the subject, and so forth. So this is how I see the disjunctive synthesis, and I do think that both poles of the synthesis are capable, okay, of two forms of exercise. Okay, one which would be oppression, murder, violence, cruelty. Okay, in all its forms. And the other exercise is precisely the counter-violence, preventing violence, and so forth. So it is indeed the same faculty which does both, just as in the case of perception. It's the same faculty which can perceive that a mountain is in front of me and which can delude me into believing that there's a mountain in front of me. Okay? For example, when sufficiently manipulated with LSD and so forth. But it's the same capacity. Okay? And, but the identity of this capacity can be read in two ways. Either in terms of its successes, which might be an overemphasis in the current North American tradition that I refer to, or with an overemphasis on the conditions of failure. But I do think they're both equiprimordial, both possibility and impossibility. Okay, so you can in my view, Derrida overemphasizes impossibility for good reasons. He had good reasons for doing this. But I think in your ontology of right, both are equiprimordial, the conditions of possibility and the conditions of impossibility. And I do not think that the conditions of impossibility necessarily ruin the conditions of possibility. They are the enemy of the conditions of possibility, but they don't necessarily ruin them. Which leads me to my fourth and last point, violence. So let's start with a fairly basic concept of violence, where we might want to think of violence in terms of, say, the violation of a limit, and then we can say that at least some violence is also generated by the law. Okay, the law generates, as the capacity that I was trying to describe, generates the capacities for new forms of violence. Okay, very simple example. Okay, laws say against sexual harassment. Okay, laws against sexual harassment are good. Okay, but laws against sexual harassment can be used for other forms of harassment. Okay, you can meta-harass someone. Okay, so and that's a new form of violence generated by the oppression of violence. So sometimes, okay, the oppression of violence generates violent oppression. Okay, where there's this form of meta-evil, which in my view is exactly what Kant and Schelling were after with their concept of radical evil. Radical evil is meta-evil, which is why Schelling always says evil is intelligent. Not like in the Augustinian tradition, evil is like the stupid material body that I am. Okay, evil is hyper-reflected. And so this is sometimes associated with law, but again, not necessarily. Okay, only if you're still in the grip of the Kantian and Hobbesian paradox, does it look as if the establishment or constitution of a limit were as such already, okay, the violation of a limit. The establishment of a limit is as such not necessarily, sometimes it is, depending on the environment, but there's no conceptual necessity to think of the constitution or institution of a limit as of the violation of a limit such that this violation does amount to violence. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So it depends very much on both the historical context and so forth, but I don't think it's necessary, not in all cases, that is. Okay, and if that's the case, okay, then I do think there's no need to face, okay, Derrida's point in La Force de la Loi that all institutions, or that the law as such, okay, that there's something in the concept of the law which makes it paradoxical in that way. I do think there is a paradox about the institution of the law, but this paradox, okay, is associated not with the universal quantifier or the modality of necessity, but rather with the modality with the existential quantifier or restricted quantifier and the modality of contingency. Okay, precisely because law is a capacity, it's associated with a capacity, and that that makes it objective. Okay, so it's capacities can be objective because there are facts about them. Okay, so they don't generate the facts about them, but there are facts about capacities. For example, the facts that I'm trying to uncover. If I'm right, there are those facts about those capacities. If I'm wrong, they are not. Okay, so this is which is why I do think that only if you presuppose a huge amount of ontology, okay, and invest this inflate your concept of object with a way too big ontology and bad ontology, the traditional one where to exist is to be roughly a mesoscopic spatiotemporal object. If that's your ontology, then of course you run into all these problems. But if you allow for a different concept of objectivity, then there's no reason, okay, to deflate the social sphere and to think of it in Humean terms. Yeah, I don't even need 5 minutes, just one. So this just leads me to the conclusion that with Hegel what we can have, or with the Hegelian account of rationality, what we can have is a concept of genuine action explanation. Okay, so again, if you have this bad ontology, you will think that explanation is something like making explicit a cause and effect structure in the mechanic sense. Okay, but if you have a good concept of normativity, then you can have something like a genuine action explanation. So why did he steal the car? Okay, well, because, and now you can give an answer. Okay, so why did he steal the car does not force you to say something like, because the particles in his brain moved in a certain way due to the wind coming from the, and so forth. You can really say, no, he stole the car because he wanted to steal the car. Why does Lewis leave? Because someone is waiting for him and not because his brain moves in. And so okay, so I think that's a fair enough conclusion, so we can open the debate. Yeah.